Welcome everybody to this panel discussion, which is very excited to talk about hearing conditions and in particular related to stigma related to hearing conditions. My name is Dr. Jessica Vitkovich and I'll be facilitating our discussion today, but I'd love to introduce our wonderful panel. We have Mr. Scott Fisher, who has a background, I believe, in biomedical sciences, but he's currently in the financial planning area and is a director in his financial planning practice. And brings to today his lived experience of having a hearing condition. We've also got Dr. Barbara Timmer, who has a background as an audiologist, but is also an academic or research fellow working with the University of Queensland, and also works for a hearing care company called Sonova, and is also our president of Audiology Australia as well. And then finally, we've got Dr. Katie Ekberg, who is also a research fellow at the University of Queensland and comes to us with a wealth of expertise with a background of psychology, but also research into hearing conditions and the psychosocial aspects in particular around that as well. So thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to ask you, what made you want to come and be involved in this discussion?
Well, to begin with, I think, you know, being part of, you know, my involvement with Better Hearing Australia is really around, I think, just getting I suppose, just some more thoughts out there around hearing conditions was the main part of it for me, and really just to share my story. I think that was the main part of it as well.
Yeah. Barbara and Katie, I know you guys are doing some research in this area, so I understand there's already an interest, but would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, so we're currently just started a research project that's looking at how stigma is experienced and managed by people with hearing impairment, and getting a bit more of a comprehensive view of how people with hearing impairment actually experience stigma, and then also how that stigma, the relationship between that stigma and seeking help for their hearing, and also uptake of hearing rehabilitation like hearing aids, and what that relationship looks like.
Yeah.
Yes, and from my personal point of view as a clinical audiologist, I'm interested to see how, if we address the topic, whether we can improve people's experiences of their hearing conditions and help them along in their journey towards hearing care, and how sometimes the language and the imagery we might be using to talk about hearing conditions, hearing difficulties, and devices like hearing aids could be improved to reduce stigma.
Yeah, I think that'll be a lovely discussion for later. I'd love to know how we can change that a bit too.
Yeah.
More of that. So obviously, like, stigma, I suppose, is associated with a lot of different health types of conditions, but particularly so, I suppose, if you think about it relative to, you know, wearing glasses versus hearing aids, there's certainly a different level of attitude or value or placed around that. But even just in terms of awareness, I suppose, in the public around hearing loss, I'm not even sure that we probably as a society underestimate that 1 in 4 of 1 in 6 at the moment, but it's projected to be 1 in 4 by 2050, is, you know, it's quite common, and yet I don't think there's the awareness around that for the general public in terms of, you know, understanding, yes, you can or can't hear, but you know, the other consequences of not being able to hear on communication, the ease of communication, fatigue, when people sort of exclude and say, oh, never mind, you know, that can stop that connection that you might have with others, and it really affects your sense of belonging and you know, relationships and things like that. And I don't think we generally sort of understand that as a society, or understand that identity, but not also, you know, around the identity or confidence as well. And we know that it's associated with higher levels of stress and anxiety and social isolation. And I think the invisible nature of hearing conditions makes it particularly hard for others to understand that. But today is, I suppose, is talking about that additional dimension, which is around the stigma, and why is that happening? What does it look like? Why does that happen? And what do we need to do about it? And so I'd like to sort of start to understand the lived experience, I suppose, about that. So I was wondering, Scott, if you could share us a little bit about the background of your hearing and sort of what it's like on a day-to-day basis, and any experiences with stigma you might have had.
Yeah, no problems. Thanks, Jess. So my hearing condition, I'm profoundly deaf in my left ear. I have significant hearing loss in my right ear. So what that basically means is that I don't hear out of my left ear. And so I need hearing aids to help me hear and help me communicate. I think some of the biggest challenges that I face on a daily basis probably relate to the workplace more than anything. In my role, it's an office-based environment. But if you can imagine, talking on the telephone can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. Boardroom meetings in particular, where there's quite some distance between people, and actually hearing and understanding what they're saying. Interestingly, with the whole working from home arrangement has actually helped the communication for me, in a sense that well, I can control the volume of my laptop from home. So previously, if you're in a boardroom situation where you might have 12 people sitting around the table, it may have been a bit difficult to hear the person at the other end of the table. Aside from that, I suppose it's the daily interactions that you have as well. You know, there's a good example is, you know, going to a coffee shop, ordering a latte. The person behind the register there says something back to me. And I think they're asking, do I want sugar? So I say, yes, I want some sugar. They ask something else. I say, yep, just one sugar, please. What they're really asking is, do you want to have here or take away? So it's a completely, not the conversation that I thought we're actually having. Of course, I should have said I want a takeaway latte. But those it's sort of funny stories in a way, but that's sort of perhaps the frustrations that people with hearing loss have to deal with, not just, you know, occasionally, but have to deal with on a constant basis. And what that sort of, I suppose, affects people in different ways. Probably one of the impacts that it's had on me over the long term is sort of just my confidence level as well. And it's probably taken quite some time to develop that level of confidence. I'd imagine other people it causes frustration. People can't hear you and can't speak with you.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think that unrelenting need to sort of ask, unrelenting need to self-advocate in a way and still be included if you've missed out be felt as either frustration or tiring, let alone the listening effort in the first place under all of these things. I understand that confidence level, and, you know, how what do you mean by the lack of confidence? Can you explore a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, I suppose I've sort of dealt with my hearing loss over the last 20 years. And so my hearing changed when I was about 18. And as you can imagine, being an 18-year-old, you're still just maturing at that point in time. You're still just sort of finding out really who you are in a sense. And that significant change was quite difficult to come to grips with. In a sense. Perhaps I had my own stigma at that point in time, and I probably did. You know, wearing a hearing aid was for old people. Hearing loss was for old people. You know, what would my friends think at that point in time? You know, what would girls think? You know, I was an 18-year-old man at that point in time. All these sorts of things were important to you at that point in time. They sound strange now. You know, could I play contact sport? It's just another example. For me, I think it was about redeveloping that confidence over time, and really the ability to talk about my hearing loss, and perhaps even knowing the words to use, and probably just the confidence inside, knowing that, well, even with hearing loss, I can still lead a full, happy and successful life.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Scott. It's really, I think, confidence at that age is already something that you have to grow and develop, but I think the added dimension of having to have a second thought, I'm always conscious about an additional element to that confidence gap, and second guessing or self-talk, I suppose. Very underestimated from what I can see. We don't see that. Nobody talks about that, do they? I think.
No, not at all. I mean, you mentioned about the invisible nature of things before, and certainly if you imagine in social settings where you're perhaps either could be a dinner party, it could be a friend's house, it could be a bar, it could be anywhere, and you're perhaps meeting new people, or you're in a group conversation with people. What I struggle with is actually keeping up with the conversation, what's happening, particularly where there might be 4 or 5 people discussing something. And what I find happens is that I'll withdraw from the conversation just purely because I can't keep up. I don't actually know what's being discussed. And if you're meeting someone new at that time, well, you don't just initially say, hey, everyone, I'm hard of hearing, or I can't hear you very well. You tend to just withdraw from it. And those people might think, well, gee, Scott's a bit quiet. You know, is he always like that? And that's not the sort of person I am. I enjoy talking with people, if I can hear them properly, that is. So it's sort of, again, dealing with those sort of situations, but it's also becoming confident to deal in those sort of situations as well. And I think too, it's also, I suppose, the community at the same time, knowing how to respond in those situations as well. So I've been in situations probably many years ago now where senior colleagues have sort of, their response has been making light of the situation and joking. And for different people, that can have just different impacts as well. And perhaps that was their way of dealing with the situation, not really knowing how to respond to the whole issue.
Yeah. I think you've touched on quite a wonderful array of elements that I think relate so well to stigma. Like the fact that hearing loss is not just can you or can't you hear. It's around the confidence that you were talking around, the social impacts that has, the emotional impacts that has, and how you grow as a person, but also that journey of having to be your own self-advocate and feel empowered to do that. And I think the pressure of stigma adds that layer that takes away a bit of that empowerment to be able to ask for what you need and things like that. So I'm really glad you've shared your story on all of that. I think that it's fascinating. It touches on so many of the things that we wanted to discuss today. But from your perspective, Katie and Barbara, is this very familiar to from your background in research and things like this?
Absolutely, Scott, and thank you so much for sharing your insights, because you've hit the nail on the head. This is something that in the clinic, in an audiology clinic, we see a lot of, and a lot of our counselling in the clinic is often about telling people and being okay about telling people that you may have some hearing difficulties. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to be a bother, or I don't want to put people out, or, you know, I don't want it to become an embarrassing situation. And yet, and so it's hard to do that self-advocating. But when people do, it really improves communication and social interactions, and there's a whole host of benefits. But sometimes it's very, very hard to do that, to simply say, look, I have some difficulty hearing you. And so we see time and again that people do shy away from saying that.
Yeah. And look, it's probably, I actually think that the self-confidence, that's my view anyway, is probably the biggest step to you actually sort of coming forward and saying something, because most of the time the other person responds quite well to the situation.
Yeah.
If they understand that you need some sort of assistance or support, it might be they just need to slow their voice down a little bit. They just need to talk a little bit louder. That might be all that's required. But if you don't tell them that, then there's nothing that can be done with that as well.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I remember just last year, we through the business that I deal with, we were doing an annual client seminar where I was the keynote speaker, and we were talking on the subject of the 2019 budget, upcoming federal election, and the impact on investment markets. And I had to present to around about 150 of our clients. And I had no problem with the talking to clients, up there on stage presenting. Had no issue with potentially clients asking questions. My biggest fear in leading up to that was that, would I be able to hear what these people would ask me at the end of the presentation? So, different people have different sort of fears, but my fear wasn't actually doing the presentation. It was, will I be able to hear the questions at the end of the day? But what we actually did is we made sure we had some roaming mics, and the host came up and facilitated questions at the end of the presentation. And it worked out fine. I could hear all the questions, answered them, and it was a successful presentation in the end. Yeah. So, yeah, being prepared in those sort of situations, and again, just asking for that support.
Yeah.
The host knew of my hearing conditions. Other people who were setting up the venue knew of that as well.
Yeah. You've got to have that confidence to be able to feel that you can disclose these sorts of things, to be able to prepare and have other people support you, because doing it on your own is hard enough, but when you've got other people supporting, it makes an incredible difference. But it does require you to get the help and ask for what you need. And I suppose is a fear of discrimination is one form of stigma. Like, from Katie, from your perspective, is discrimination a part of how you might define stigma?
Yeah, definitely. So if going back to sort of like, I guess the theoretical definition of stigma is, having a physical or social attribute that results in being categorized as different to others, and then also being discredited for that attribute. So then, yeah, some of the consequences of that stigma can be a broad range of things, from an individual level to a system level, and being discriminated in different ways because of a certain attribute. And I think, as Scott was talking about before, there's sort of two types of stigma, and hearing loss can fall into both of those types. So the first one is where that stigmatized attribute is not obvious all the time. So it's only occasionally obvious to other people or occasionally apparent, but not all the time. And so having a hearing loss can fall into that type of stigma, because it might not be, you know, obvious to everyone all the time. But then the other type of stigma is when that attribute is visibly obvious to everyone all the time. And so if someone's wearing a visible hearing aid, then they could also fit into that type of stigma where it is more obvious to everyone that they have a hearing impairment or that they're wearing a hearing aid. So hearing loss kind of falls into, both those types of stigma. And that can have consequences for people if they're feeling stigmatized, not engaging in conversation all the time, trying to conceal their hearing impairment, maybe avoiding social interaction, which can then lead to sort of having more constrained social networks and, as you said before, Jess, social isolation because of that. And then we've also heard people talk about sort of more direct forms of discrimination where they feel like they're not going to be given a job because of their hearing loss, so things like that, more direct, like not being able to access particular resources or things like that. The discrimination or the consequences from stigma can sort of be quite broad ranging in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting how you classify the two types that you've discussed there, and like I'm just thinking of the term selective hearing for the first one you described is that intermittent nature, and it's almost it's a joke that people, he's got selective hearing, and it sort of only sort of minimises the actual impact is of that. So I found that resonated a little bit with what sometimes we hear in the community, which probably only adds to a dimension to that build of stigma, that it is just selective hearing, he's not paying attention, rather than the ability. And I think that comes down to a lot of awareness around that as well, definitely.
And I think Scott really touched on the important part of stigma is that it's a product of a social process. It's how we're sort of interacting and behaving together. That's where stigma can come from, and also how we can help counteract stigma as well. That it's not just the feelings of one person, but sort of how we're all behaving together.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even it sometimes can be just such a subtle reaction to the way somebody would react to noticing that they haven't heard, or they've responded in a way that wasn't appropriate, like you talked about, Scott, answering incorrectly to a question, but the reaction to that from the other person when that happens can also only reinforce or minimise that empowerment to be able to then go again and advocate, even in the next sentence, that unrelenting need to perhaps ask or strain for what they need. So it's interesting how that dynamic between the confidence and stigma and attitudes around that comes from probably a lack of awareness around what it actually means. I think everyone can close their eyes or take off their glasses and understand what it's like, but as we know, everybody's experience with hearing loss, with other conditions as well, but it's often hard to understand exactly what that is on a everyday basis. And that selective hearing bit is, why do you hear sometimes and not others? That really doesn't help with an understanding or an empathy, which I think is the basis for people having empathetic reactions to somebody that is having communication breakdown and things like that. In terms of, like, as clinicians, for example, how are you seeing this play out in a clinical scenario? I know you talked a little bit about help seeking, but in the audiology clinic, for example, what does this look like?
So what it often looks like is that people actually don't seek help from the moment that they may be detecting, I'm having some hearing issues, I'm having some trouble hearing. I think many of us would say, if I'm having some issues reading the paper or the books or something, then the next step is taken quite quickly in going to have your eyes tested. But it often takes a much longer time for people to present to hearing clinics to have their hearing checked and tested, or even talking to their GP about it. It takes a long time, and I think the reason for that is that there is that stigma associated with hearing difficulties being associated perhaps with older people, which is incorrect, but this is a society's view, I guess, of hearing impairment or hearing loss, and so it takes longer for them to action their hearing condition. And then it also might be another big step to actually do something about their hearing condition. And so to look at things like communication education, or help through hearing aids or other hearing devices. That's also often a big step, and that could be the step where they're actually making their invisible condition, hearing loss, more visible by wearing a hearing aid. And it's, for some people, that step is just too big, and that's why typically we see it takes 7 to 10 years between knowing that you're having some hearing difficulties to actually actioning that hearing loss. And that's a real pity, because over those 7 to 10 years, hearing has changed, and also your social interactions and your confidence in them has changed too.
Yeah. It's such a shame that it can take that long, when there's some very active things that can be done to ameliorate the consequences of that, not just hearing, but the social and emotional components to that as well. It's interesting how you talked about how it can make it more visible by having a hearing aid, but I understand in the clinic that can sometimes be a conversation. We heard how hearing aids went from big body aids, if you think about Uncle Arthur, and I think that's a topic we might discuss on where some of these stigmas come from. But you've got these big aids, and there's been a big emphasis on making them as small as possible and as invisible as possible. And I think this is something of a need because of the stigma, perhaps. What are your thoughts on that?
I think yes. I think that hearing aids have gone in that direction because of the stigma, but I think we're also at a point where we're kind of in a little bit of a vicious circle with that, because of the focus now in audiology, with hearing aids being as small as possible and invisible as possible. We've observed in some of the audiology appointments we've looked at in previous research that audiologists often start to bring up how small hearing aids are, and that they won't be visible before the clients have even talked about that being an issue for them at all. And you also get in a lot of the advertising for hearing aids, straight away it's the focus is on how small they are or how invisible they are, which kind of reinforces that message that a hearing aid should be something that's concealed. So that kind of then can reinforce the stigma as well. Whereas, like you said, again, that's very different to glasses, where glasses are a fashion item now, and we kind of, make them visible and fit in with our style. So, again, it's kind of a bit of a difficult loop where to help with stigma, we've tried to make them more invisible for people that were concerned about that, but then it also kind of reinforces the stigma at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting this sort of balance between feeling like you need to succumb to the pressure of societals, in having something small, but at the same time wanting to be empowered to be able to have, it's like it must be such a frustrating component to that. I know. Did that ever come up for you, Scott, when you were getting fitted with a hearing aid? Was the look of it an issue for you?
Oh, definitely, yes.
Yeah.
When you first, I suppose, seeing the audiologist, when it got my very first hearing aid, you didn't want it to be visible at all. So that was sort of what I was looking for. Again, sort of back to my story that I wasn't really at the point where I was sort of willing to accept it at that point as well. And to Barbara's point there about the time it takes to, I suppose, just accept some of these things, it can take a very long time because you're dealing with a couple of components. One is the actual the hearing component in itself. So when you're fitted with a hearing aid, all of a sudden sounds are just completely different, and things are not what you remember them to be. They sound a little bit different. So you're adjusting for that, which really doesn't take all that long. But then you're adjusting to the social side of it and what we're talking about today. So the fact you're dealing with it yourself, that I'm now hard of hearing, I need to wear this hearing aid, this is part of who I am. As well as your family accepting that, your colleagues, your friends, etc. as well. And that probably takes much longer time than just the initial 3 months, say, of getting used to hearing a little bit differently with the hearing aids. So there's a few different things that are playing out there all at the same time for the individual.
Absolutely, and I think you've said it nicely, Scott. It's about identity, right? And it's your change in identity that happens when you might be wearing a hearing aid and you think, okay, so everybody can now see that I belong to a group in society called those with hearing loss or the hearing impaired or whatever terminology you want to use. And I think that's why stigma is such a big aspect, because it does, we tell ourselves that our identity has changed and is different. And it's back to that self-talk about how do you deal with that change in identity, and that is a long-term thing. That's certainly, we have seen some people who are incredibly robust in terms of showing absolutely no signs of stigma due to their hearing condition, but they're rare, and it is a path that people are on in their hearing journey, not only in terms of hearing care, but also their identity as an individual, and also as a member of a family or a partnership or as their spouse, etc.
Yeah.
Just a further thought to that, and sort of working with audiologists over the years, so the focus is very much on the hearing aid and your hearing ability, and so and I've worked with some fantastic professionals, and there's limited advice or support about the issue we're talking about now, about how to then live with your hearing aids. And that's no disrespect to any of the great audiologists that are out there. They're trained in their field. They're not psychologists as well. But perhaps maybe that's something that needs to be taught or trained during their profession, is then how to, that maybe the soft skills that are required to be an audiologist as well.
Absolutely. I think you're preaching to the converted.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to play this video forever and ever to anyone I can.
Yeah, no, but it's exactly right. I think the device in the technology, as wonderful as it is a lot of the focus in a lot of ways, and it's also a short period of time that we're dealing with a lot of people at the acute stage of around a fitting and things like that. But what is the support that's around there for the types of growth as a person with a hearing loss that you're talking about? Is that personal adjustment, not just to how you hear, but also the personal adjustment in your identity, your confidence, your own journey in how you communicate that. And as I think you said it, what are the words that you need to start finding in order to be confident around asking and things like that. I think that's a really lovely point, that there's more to be done in this space. Definitely. So I want to touch a little bit on, where do you think this all comes from? I alluded to Uncle Arthur, for example, was one that's, for those that don't know, Uncle Arthur, I think it's Russell, I can't remember what his name is, but a comedian that used to play a lovable character that he actually based, I think, on his father, who had a body aid. But it's a very much of a parody around somebody a very much older adult with a big hearing aid and lots of wires everywhere. But I think that sort of epitomizes for me where some of these messages start to come from, that are different to, say, what we would do to somebody in a wheelchair. We wouldn't mimic, or things like that, or make a parody around these sorts of things. So is this something that I think it's unconscious too. I don't think we're even aware necessarily that this is happening, and I suspect it's getting better over the years as we get better. But where do you think stigma, is it just media? Where else is it coming from?
I think it's actually historical, because even, when eyeglasses first appeared, it was a good sign to be wearing glasses, because it meant that you could read, which meant that you had a certain standing in society. And so to need glasses was seen to be actually a positive, because therefore you must be a scholar and therefore you must be intelligent. Whereas when we look even several hundred years back, or in the Victorian era, the schools that children and adults with hearing conditions would go to would be deaf and dumb schools. And so there certainly wasn't a association between having a hearing condition or having reduced hearing and being intelligent, whereas having reduced vision and being intelligent because you needed glasses, there was an association there. So I think it goes a long way back from even the terminology that we used back then. And then when the first hearing aids came onto the market, people would say things like, why aren't you hearing me? You have your hearing aid now. And even the hearing aids 10 years ago versus the hearing aids now, they've come such a long way. But they are still hearing aids. They don't restore hearing. They don't cure hearing. There's still a number of other aspects that have to happen. And I think sometimes also not being aware, as we've talked about before, of what a hearing loss means to that individual and their communication and their interactions, often means that sometimes people will say, well, it's just a hearing loss, i.e. it's just a sensory loss, or, well, you've got hearing aids now, why are you still not hearing me well? And I think what we need to do is address that awareness and really look at a more holistic picture of how hearing impairment affects people in a whole broad range of ways.
Yeah, definitely. I remember working in the government for a little while and saw they have lots of historical photos of council plans and things popped up on the walls, and I literally saw the St Kilda Road Deaf and Dumb Institute, and it was just a big shock, like, oh, this is not that long ago actually. That's where we've come from. So yeah, totally resonate with that. And I think even in the advertising for hearing aids or hearing services, it's usually an older adult that's pictured and things like that. And sort of it becomes an unconscious attitude, and we all sort of hold, unless we're conscious of it, to not perpetuate it in a thing that way. Definitely. So and I think we haven't even touched on cultural differences as well. I think, which is an interesting thing. Being better hearing, we deal with a lot of underserved populations and refugees, and there's certainly a very different level of stigma that comes from different cultural areas too, which I think is an additional dimension for some cultures as well, around it's unlucky, perceptions of it being unlucky. or bad luck and things like that. So yeah, I can only imagine the additional dimension of that, and not wanting to disclose it, and wanting to even wear a hearing aid because it does signal. So yeah, attitudes to help seeking would be extra hard to overcome in that situation, for sure. Cool. So I suppose I'm interested now to think about what can we do maybe to start overcoming some of these problems with stigma, so that maybe people can feel that they can seek help when they need it, and that they can feel that they can disclose, they can feel empowered to advocate for their needs. It's a big question there. I know it's changed the whole of the world, the whole of society.
I mean, I think it's a question that we hope to be able to answer a bit more thoroughly in maybe a year or so's time, when we've done some more of the research in this area. It's definitely what we want to answer. I think from research that's already being done, I think it sort of points in the direction that family support or significant other support, as well as broader social support, can be a key factor in helping overcome stigma, and that people who are around others who have positive attitudes towards helping hearing loss and helping with hearing rehabilitation, that that can really help someone have a more successful route towards helping their hearing, with help seeking, and then also with hearing rehab or hearing aids. So that's one factor that we definitely want to look into more. I don't know whether Scott, with his experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of social support there just immediately sounds appealing, and I'm sure it would to anyone who's suffering from hearing loss. So whether that's social support, like you said, from other people in similar situations, or just within your family as well, having a strong network of people that are there to support you as well. It's something I probably wish that I had more of over my journey as well.
Yeah, and I guess that can sort of extend to organisational support as well, like for people in work, whether there are structures within organisations in place that offer that support. Like Scott, you were talking before about, doing the presentation and having, other people being able to support what it was that you were worried about in doing the presentation, and hearing the questions and things like that can make a difference.
And I think too, it's the ability for you then to feel confident to ask that question. So it's then, again, you being able to get past that fear of discrimination, to realise that, well, this support is actually there if I just reach out for it as well.
I think
absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, Barbara, go.
I was just going to say, you said earlier, Scott, that most people, once you let them know that you have some trouble hearing them, they're very willing to help, and most people are. They just need to be told how they can help. And I think it's just having the words, and again it's back to that confidence, but having those words and being able to say, look, it would really help me if you could do this or that. Most people would be more than willing to do that.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories of feeling like a burden to have to keep asking, when people do ask though and feel that they're entitled to ask, it's amazing that everyone is willing to help. They just weren't aware because of the invisible nature, or they didn't know how. And so yeah, that ability to have that confident voice to, yeah, feel entitled. That, and that, I think that's what you're alluding to, Scott, when you're talking about confidence in some elements around that. But yeah, it's that inner talk of feeling like a burden, and then getting frustrated or resentful potentially if they're not getting the help they need. I've heard a lot of stories around that, and feeling in that constant battle between angry and burden between that. But wouldn't it be lovely if everybody was aware and that we all felt like everybody's responsibility? Because I think this is one of the things you alluded to, Scott, before, is I think having IT troubles with a lot of the video conferencing and the lack of communication when our headsets don't work is just giving everybody else a little bit of an inkling of what it might be like for people with hearing troubles, in having that frustration of not. But I think everyone's getting a little bit of an awareness of what that's like, and how it's tiring, and how you have to have extra energy to troubleshoot and ask for repeats, not just once but a couple of times, in order to feel like you're participating and feeling connected to what's going on in all of that. And so I'm hoping we can learn from some of what COVID situation has helped with this, with the awareness. I don't know if there's any final words from the panel. I'm going to wrap it up. I think we could go on forever. I think we're only scratching the surface with some of this as well. But was any final words that you would like to share that you think is important to this discussion?
I would love to have this discussion again in a year's time, where we could maybe talk about the findings from our research, and touch base with you, Jess, and you, Scott, and talk about what has come out of that research.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's a date.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd be happy to be involved in that.
Awesome.
Great.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. I'm utterly internally grateful. I think everything that I wanted to get out of this discussion we've touched on. There's opportunities to go deeper and things like that, but I think I'm a true believer that awareness and empathy is the first step to sharing, I suppose, the responsibility for hearing and communication, not just for the person with the hearing condition, but for everything. It benefits everybody. And so having these types of discussion are incredibly powerful step in order to bring that change that we would love to see. So I am very much grateful for all of your contributions. You've brought so much wealth and personalisation through the stories and your experience, and I'm, as I said, truly thankful for your time to come that way. And I encourage, well, we're going to keep the conversation going in another year, but I encourage everybody to keep this conversation going. I would love if people share what we're talking about, they continue the conversation online and things like that. But I'm going to wrap it up for now and say thank you for being here in our panel, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ta.